Okay, so in the last video I introduced the problem of justice or of rights. And some people have thought that rule consequentialism is sufficient to deal with that. The idea is a set of rules that includes some restrictions on what we're allowed to do, and includes some requirements that we take the past into account, will account for justice and rights. So for example, to take the example of transferring money or transferring enough money in order to transfer well-being from person one to person two, we could say that a set of rules that said everyone should be brought out of deprivation by means of transfer from those with more to those with less would be a better rule than one that leaves them in deprivation, but it would also be a better rule than one that would leave people completely equal, right? Now, why would that be the case? Why would it be the case that you would get more well-being out of having only transfers between scenarios A and B? And if you're wondering about this, go back and rewatch the previous video. Why would it be better to have transfers only between A and B be allowed, but no transfers between A and C, right? Well, there's all sorts of economic reasons. Like, there are economic benefits to inequality. If you made everybody absolutely equal, you probably wouldn't have a lot of capital available for investment, right? So you might be aware that there are firms that when they start out, they need a lot of money. Banks are unsure about them, especially firms that are like doing a new thing, making a new product or something like that. Banks are often a little bit hesitant to invest in them. And banks are oftentimes, banks are in some senses very conservative investors. They can sometimes take absurdly stupid risks, and we have banking crises because of that. But usually when they're taking absurd risks, they're taking absurd risks on something that's worked well in the past. Right? So the last time this happened was with mortgage-backed securities. Banks invested a lot in various ways in mortgages because mortgages were a tried and true method of making investments. But banks are sometimes a little more hesitant to invest in something like social media, right? When social media companies first started getting off the ground, they didn't go to banks. They didn't like go to Wells Fargo. They went to angel investors, people with a lot of money willing to take a risk on investing in products that seem like they have a future, but they're risky. Well, there can't be angel investors in a scenario where everyone makes the same amount of money, because no one has enough money to just like throw a few $1,000,000 at a good new idea. And if you think Facebook didn't turn out to be a good idea, well, you're right. But like, think about TikTok. I don't know. I don't even know if TikTok's a social network or social media. I'm really not sure what TikTok is. But so there are some reasons to say if everybody's equal, that's a problem. There's also questions of like, well, why would one keep working hard if you keep giving all of one's money to lazy people? And so, like, one's still going to work hard in scenario B because one's still keeping most of what they produce. And they're still ending up with a better life than they would have if they didn't work hard, right? But in scenario C, if one stops working hard, well, apparently that leaves him in the same situation as person two, someone who wasn't working hard, which is the exact same situation he's in. So mild redistribution doesn't get rid of incentives to work. Some people pretend that it does, but it's just it's an objectively established fact that it doesn't have much effect on incentives. But actual equality across the board for everybody, well, that's definitely going to reduce your incentives to work. Right? So some people have thought, no, rule consequentialism takes care of this. Rule consequentialism would probably allow the transfer between the move from scenario A to scenario B, where you do transfers from person one to person two, but small transfers, but probably wouldn't allow C. Why? Because if you allowed C, you would have to do it all the time. Because remember, rule consequentialism is about everybody in society accepting the rule, as opposed to just looking at a single case. You're saying this rule has to hold all the time. Right? Similarly, you might think a set of rules that made it inappropriate for people's private lives to be managed by the community because the community doesn't like the way they're living, you might think there would be rules against that, right? Because if you allow that, right? Let's say, to use my example, I practice some non-standard religion in a community full of Puritans. The Puritans are upset by the fact that I do that. They're unhappy, right? It reduces their pleasure to know that I'm there doing Wiccan things, doing like witchcraft in my basement. If that's true, then on act consequentialism, it looks like maybe they have a case for stopping me from practicing my religion. But assume you allow that, right? Assume you have a rule that says anytime the community doesn't like what somebody does, they can force them to change. Well, Mill actually has a whole book about why, in the long run, that kind of interference in private decision-making, private decisions about how to live your life, is bad for society. That it basically stops all progress by creating a kind of uniformity that eliminates critical thinking, eliminates new ideas, right? So there's some case to be made that rule consequentialism is better than act consequentialism when it comes to dealing with justice and rights. And that's the main reason that people have attributed rule consequentialism to Mill. It's clear that Mill is somehow responding to the problem of justice and rights in the final chapter of On Utilitarianism. And some of the stuff he says in chapter 2 sounds like rule consequentialism. He never comes out and says it. In fact, I think the best reading of what he's doing in chapter 2, remember, is that he's endorsing the rules of thumb approach rather than rule consequentialism. Go back to a previous video about that. But he's clearly trying to deal with the problem in chapter 5. So what does he say in chapter 5? Well, what he says in chapter 5 is not rule consequentialism. What he says in chapter 5 is what has come to be known as sanction consequentialism. And to explain that, I first need to explain what a sanction is. Sanctions are the topic of chapter 3. In chapter 3, Mill's considering the question, like, well, what motivation do people have to abide by the principle of utility? What motivations do people have to follow this rule? And what he goes through and says is all the kinds of motivations that people can have to act morally in general are going to be available to utilitarians, so that there's no difference between utilitarians and other kinds of moral theorists on this issue. And he divides the potential motivations into two categories. Now, he uses the term sanctions, right? So we'll use a sanction is just anything that motivates someone to act in a certain way. Right? And there are external sanctions and internal sanctions. An external sanction is what somebody, like a third party, does to motivate you, right? So, for example, when I place a certain amount of points on an assignment, that provides an external sanction for you to do that assignment. When the school requires you to take a course, right, that's an external sanction designed to motivate you to take that course. The idea being they know you want the degree, and they say the only way we're giving you the degree is if you take this course. Those are incentives, right? But there's also punishments, right? When the mugger tells you, give me your wallet or I shoot you, they're providing an external sanction in favor of you giving them your wallet because you're afraid of the bad thing they'll do. Right? So when school places a requirement on you, they're saying, we will give you this degree if you meet all these requirements. The mugger is saying, I will take your life away from you if you don't do this thing that I want. So there are external sanctions. Internal sanctions are the motivations that come from within you. So feelings of pride or guilt are the most common examples here. Right? When you do something that you think is good, you naturally feel a sense of pride in it. And a sense of pride, that's a good feeling, like when you're proud of yourself, right? Hopefully you've had this feeling at some point. But when you do something that you think is really good, when you do a really good job at something, when you do something you think is morally good, you get a very pleasant internal feeling. It's one that you'll probably want to feel again. And when you do things that you think are really bad, you get that feeling of guilt, right? And those feelings, the desire to have some of those feelings or to avoid some of those feelings, can provide extra motivation to do the right thing. So there are internal sanctions and there are external sanctions. And what Mill thinks is every moral theory needs to have some idea of what kind of sanctions are possible for in favor of behaving the way the moral theory tells you to. What the argument in chapter 3 is all about is the argument that such sanctions exist for utilitarianism. I'm not going to go into what he has to say in chapter 3 much here, though. The reason I bring up sanctions is that there's a comment in chapter 5 that really, it goes by really fast, and Mill doesn't emphasize it much, but if you take it seriously, it means that he is not only not an act consequentialist, it means he's really far from being an act consequentialist. He's still going to end up being a kind of consequentialist. But this one phrase, this one comment that I'm going to show you next, is the key to understanding what sanction consequentialism is. All right, so we're in chapter 5. We go down here, bottom page 33. And Mill says, whenever we call something wrong, we mean to imply that a person ought to be punished somehow for doing it. If not by law, by the opinion of his fellow creatures. If not by opinion, by the reproaches of his own conscience. So what he's here talking about is, first, an external sanction, law. Second, another external sanction, the opinion of his fellow creatures. Right? So in addition to the law punishing you for things, sometimes society can just punish you for things. Like if you are the kind of person who completely legally cheats someone out of their home, maybe the law can't do anything to you, but you don't get invited to parties anymore. There was actually a fairly prominent case of this. Alan Dershowitz, a lawyer who teaches at Harvard Law School, very rich, very powerful, very important guy, a part of high society. He's one of the people who defended O.J. during O.J.'s trial in the early to mid 90s. Once he started defending Donald Trump publicly and in the media, he found that he wasn't being invited to Martha's Vineyard anymore. And he went on television and complained about this, not realizing it would cause everyone to laugh at him. Where he was like, the injustice of no longer being invited to parties at Martha's Vineyard has been terrible. Well, what he's talking about is the genuine harm that could be caused by other people excluding us from society. Mill has an entire book called On Liberty about how sparingly we should use this kind of sanction, the opinion of our fellow creatures. But we're not going to get into that here. And then finally, he talks about internal sanctions, if not by opinion, by the reproaches of his own conscience. But the general principle is, and I'll write it out here, and I'll eventually, I'll provide this all for you. But part of sanction consequentialism is, and we'll call this A. Well, here, I'll make it blue. An action is wrong if and only if it ought to be sanctioned. The idea being an action is wrong only if it's the case that there ought to be a sanction applied preventing you from doing it. And that could be an internal or an external sanction. Right? Now, this really changes things, right? From act consequentialism. Why? Well, because you then have to ask, well, when ought we to sanction actions? And then B is going to be we ought to sanction an action when it would maximize good consequences to do so. That's the sense in which this is still a form of consequentialism. But what this means is you're not testing a particular action that a person would perform, every particular action a person would perform, by its consequences. The only thing you're testing by its consequences is the decision whether to punish them. That's the only way consequences matter. Right? So let's say I'm deciding whether or not I should cheat on my taxes. Right? Let's say I have decided, like I'm facing this tax decision. I've got some money that I could get away with not reporting and not paying a tax on, and I'm considering whether I should do it. Act consequentialism says I should consider what the consequences would be of paying taxes on this income versus not paying the taxes on the income. And if it turns out that not paying the taxes on the income has better consequences than taxes on the income, than paying it, then it's right to not pay my taxes. But you test the action you're considering performing by its consequences. Sanction consequentialism says no. The answer to the question about whether or not I ought to cheat on my taxes in this case is just whether or not it would be right to punish me for doing so. Whether or not other people or myself ought to punish me for doing so. So you'd be asking, should I feel guilty about this? You'd be asking, should other people dislike me or blame me for cheating on my taxes? Should the government arrest me for not paying my taxes? And only that question about punishment, only that gets referred to its consequences when you're trying to decide what to do. So that when you try to decide, like, well, should the government arrest me for not paying my taxes? You then need to think about things like, well, what would happen if the government didn't arrest people for not paying their taxes or didn't punish people in some way for not paying their taxes? Wouldn't everybody stop paying their taxes? And if the answer is yes, you might think, well, that would be really bad if people stop paying their taxes, right? When people stop paying taxes, society falls. Right? Because government falls, and without government, you have society for a little while until people start eating each other. Not literally, but sometimes. So you might say, well, yeah, the government has good reason to punish me for doing this. And that's not to say the government's going to catch you. Even if you know you won't be caught, you still know it's true that the government ought to punish you for doing it, if they could catch you. And then you ask, like, well, should the members of my society blame me for doing it? Right? The question is about when you should blame people for Mill is going to be like, well, can you get them to improve their behavior by blaming? Right? That's why he thinks you ought to blame people. Is you're trying to change the way they behave by castigating them. Right? And the question is, like, is it better if people pay their taxes? Yeah. Can you get people to pay their taxes by, like, shunning them in public? Right? So, like, if everyone realizes someone's a tax cheat and then stop inviting them to parties at Martha's Vineyard, can you get the tax cheat to start paying their taxes? Maybe. Right? Which then suggests, yeah, you should blame them. Right? Other people should blame you for it. Should you feel guilty? Right? This is a very complex question. The question of internal sanctions gets really complex because the issue is going to be like, will you lead a better life yourself? And will you do better good for other people if you develop a tendency to feel guilt about doing certain things? The reason why it gets complex is the feeling of guilt is itself a kind of pain, Mill thinks. And so as a result, you're having to make a fairly complicated calculation about how much pain you're feeling versus how much improvement in behavior that pain gets you to have, and then how much good that does for you or others that you get that marginal increase in quality of your behavior. There's all sorts of stuff that goes into it. But importantly, for sanction consequentialism, it is only the decision about whether and how much to apply sanctions that consequences play a role in. Or to put it another way, consequences should only enter into, for example, government decisions through, like, criminal justice policy. It should all be about whether it's a good idea to use state power to harm someone for doing this. And if not, then you shouldn't make it against the law. And when we're involved in interpersonal relationships, we should be thinking, like, how much good will it do to give someone a hard time about this? Because sometimes it doesn't, right? Like, suppose you find out someone has an addiction, right? They are addicted to some drug. Does it really do any good to like blame them for that? No, it doesn't. Does it do any good to feel guilty about that? No, it doesn't. Right? Your guilt isn't going to get you to stop taking heroin, probably. Other people blaming you, other people like calling you nasty names for taking heroin, isn't going to stop you from taking heroin. The government throwing you in jail is probably not going to stop you from taking heroin. Which means, Mill thinks, while it's still a good idea to stop taking heroin, it's not morally wrong to take it. You're not violating a law of morality. You're being irrational because you're not pursuing your own well-being as well as you could. But what Mill wants to say is there's a difference between just being irrational, right, and doing something that's morally wrong. It's only morally wrong if other people and yourself have reason to harm you in some way because you do it. And that's only going to be true when it's the case that your behavior can be improved by harming you. So there's going to be a lot of things that on sanction consequentialism turn out not to be wrong, even though they reduce the overall well-being in society, right? For example, one of the things I get on myself the most for is wasting time by playing stupid video games, right? I've been playing video games basically since video games were a thing. And I probably would know a couple extra languages, right? I'd probably know like tons more math. I'd probably have read most of these books that are on like along my walls that I haven't read or that I just own because they make me look smart. I'd probably actually have read those books if I hadn't gotten so really, really good at StarCraft. I'm pretty good at StarCraft. Protoss. On act consequentialism, right? An action is right if and only if it is the action that maximizes good consequences relative to the other options available. I've been doing something morally wrong every time I played a video game. And that seems harsh. Like, it's dumb that I play video games as much as I do, but like, it's morally wrong for me to play StarCraft. I want to play StarCraft later tonight when I'm done making these videos. Am I doing something morally wrong? Mill thinks, no, you're not doing something morally wrong. Maybe it's dumb, but not everything that's dumb is morally wrong. All that's morally wrong is what society has reason to punish you for. And consequentialism only comes in telling society when it ought to punish you and when it ought not. Now, the benefit of sanction consequentialism is, for one thing, it's going to provide lots of reasons to respect rights. Right? The question will then become, does society give reason to punish you for doing something that pisses other people off? Right? Let's say you practice a minority religion and it's making other people angry. Is there good reason for society to punish you for that? Well, no, because Mill thinks, in general, a society that punishes nonconformists is one that in the long term has a marked tendency to not make progress, right? Because there's no free exchange of ideas in that society. That, again, is in a book of his called On Liberty, which you can find on the same website where you can find this reading if you're interested. It's a short book, and it makes the argument that he only sort of gestures at in chapter 5 of this book. So he thinks, no, even if it's true that someone practicing a minority religion will reduce the overall well-being, that doesn't make it wrong because it's true that the society ought not punish you for it. What about the transfers from person 1 to person 2? Should we punish one, right, by forcing them to transfer, right, their material wealth? Well, no, because a society that forces people into this kind of equality is one that will experience lower economic growth over the long term, and everybody will be worse off. The idea is that in the long term, while C might lead 2 to being better off, in the long term, if you do this for everybody, everybody's going to end up below the poverty line, right? That C naturally turns into D, where 1 and 2 are equally terribly off. And if that's the case, then you shouldn't do it, right? if it's the case that people ought to be allowed to keep the stuff they earn because it provides a spur to greater economic productivity, then it's fine. Right? And so it seems like sanction consequentialism has a good chance of providing a way for utilitarianism to respect rights. It also accords with a kind of moral common sense. And here's that common sense. Common sense normally divides actions into 4 categories. The forbidden, things you must never do. The permissible, things it's okay for you to do. The obligatory, or the, let's call it duty. Oh no, what happened there? Actually, I'll keep writing obligatory. The obligatory and the supererogatory. The forbidden is something you should never do, so I'll write that over here. Must not do. Permissible is allowed to do. The obligatory is must do. Or alternatively, must not do. And supererogatory is permissible. Ugh. Actually, I'll explain supererogatory in a minute. Let me first explain what sanction utilitarianism has to say about forbidden, permissible, and obligatory, and what act consequentialism says. So let's look at act consequentialism. Act consequentialism says the right action is the one that maximizes good consequences. According to act consequentialism, then, there is a right action, the one that does the best, and then there's wrong actions, everything that's not the best. What that means is, according to act consequentialism, right, there's no such thing as permissible but not obligatory. Anything that's not your obligation is forbidden. You're obliged to do the morally best thing in every situation, and any failure to live up to that standard means you're doing something forbidden. Now, the supererogatory is something that it's permissible for you to do, and it's permissible not for you to not do, but it's better that you do it than not. So to give you an example, I pay my taxes, I don't hurt people, right? I have a job that doesn't involve me violating any laws or violating any moral requirements that go above and beyond the laws. I'm a professor, it's a fairly tame life. Let's say in addition to that, I volunteer my time at the soup kitchen. Am I doing something I have an obligation to do? Ordinarily, we would think no. We think people aren't obliged. They don't have an obligation to go to the soup kitchen. Right? It's certainly not forbidden to go to the soup kitchen, though. So it's permissible. But it's not just permissible. It's permissible, and not doing it is permissible. So going to the soup kitchen and working there, volunteering my time there is permissible. And so is staying at home and playing StarCraft. But one of them is clearly morally better than the other. It's morally better to go to the soup kitchen and volunteer your time feeding people than it is to stay home and play StarCraft. When something is, let's say we have 2 actions, right? A and B. And A and B are both permissible, right? So the check mark means they're both permissible. But A is clearly a better action than B. Then A is supererogatory. Ordinary moral common sense says there are such things. It's called going above and beyond the call of duty. Well, according to act consequentialism, because there's nothing that's just permissible, there's nothing that's supererogatory either. According to act consequentialism, everything is either forbidden or it's obligatory. What about sanction consequentialism? Well, sanction consequentialism can easily make sense of what's forbidden. What's forbidden is what there is good reason to punish or sanction. It can easily make sense of what's obligatory. Something is obligatory, or you have an obligation to do it, when it is right to punish you for not doing it. Right? So like I have an obligation to pay my taxes because it's right to punish me for not paying my taxes. What's permissible is something where it's not appropriate to punish me for doing it, and it's not appropriate to punish me for not doing it. Right? Therefore, I can do it or not do it. Either way, I'm not doing something wrong. So, according to sanction consequentialism, there's some things that you can do and they're not morally right or morally wrong. You're just fine, right? And given that one of those things is going to oftentimes turn out to increase happiness more than the other, increase good consequences more than the other, you can make sense of what's supererogatory. You can make sense of something being permissible, but better than something else that's also permissible. Right? When I go to volunteer my time at the soup kitchen, I'm doing something I'm allowed to do. I would be allowed to not do it because there's no reason to punish people for playing video games. But also, it's clear that I am creating better consequences by going to the soup kitchen to volunteer my time than I am by playing StarCraft. But because things only become right or wrong through the application of sanction, and sanctions aren't implied here, right? Sanctions aren't allowed here. I'm clearly doing a better job morally, but not in a way that makes it wrong to not do it. A way of thinking about act consequentialism is act consequentialism takes the things that seem like they're above and beyond the call of duty and says, no, that's just your duty. Act consequentialism requires the most of you at all times. Right? You have to do what's morally best all the time, and that's it. Anything else is wrong. But sanction consequentialism doesn't say that. Now, when it comes to interpreting Mill, I don't think there's much question. Sanction consequentialism is Mill's view. He basically just says it in chapter 5. For a long time, people didn't understand what his position was, and so they said it was rule consequentialism because it's clear that he doesn't like act consequentialism. Or there's a lot of places where it seems like he doesn't like act consequentialism. And act consequentialism is hopeless when it comes to rights, right? Or at least it seems that way. There are other ways to be a consequentialist that you can get around that, but I'm not going to go into them. For that, you can take an upper level ethics class. So I think it's pretty clear that Mill is a sanction consequentialist. As for this question about qualitative hedonism versus an Aristotelian functional account of the good, I think it's pretty clear that Mill's position is qualitative hedonism, but that his theory would make more sense if it was the Aristotelian functional account of the good. Everything would just work out nicer. Qualitative hedonism, I mean, you could avoid this issue about all this stuff, right? 1 through 3 here. If you just said, no, just go with Aristotle's account of the good, right? That's what makes the most sense. And it's clearly the way Mill's headed. And if you combine sanction consequentialism with an Aristotelian functional account of the good, you have, I think, a perfectly coherent moral theory about us all having an interest in making sure everybody's lives go better, but not having a reason to punish people all the time for every way they fail to make their own life or other people's lives go better, which makes sense, right? You need to back off from time to time. When you put those views together, right, I think Mill has a very plausible moral theory. It's way more plausible than classical utilitarianism. Almost nobody is a classical utilitarian anymore. There's this one guy, Peter Singer, who's a classical utilitarian, and it keeps leading him to say horrifying things like that no one with any disability should be allowed to be born because, right, there you could just have a kid without disabilities instead. And everybody's like looking at him like, dude, why are you saying this? And he's like, my theory says it. And then everybody responds with, but like we've known classical utilitarianism is like the worst kind of utilitarianism ever since Mill. Mill wasn't a classical utilitarian. And if you were to apply sanction consequentialism to the issue of like whether we should allow the people with disabilities to be born, obviously we should. We can't punish parents, right? Imagine how horrifying society would be if we punish parents for having children that society decided weren't good enough some way, right? You would avoid that like the plague. You would never punish people for that if you were being reasonable. And so sanction consequentialism would be like, of course it's not wrong. Classical utilitarianism is not a plausible moral theory. What Mill shows is that there's ways to revise it, to alter it, in order to get something closer to a plausible moral theory. So when you're comparing utilitarianism to, say, Kant's view, if you compare Kant to classical utilitarianism, most people think, well, Kant's just better, right? Classical utilitarianism implies all sorts of horrifying things. I didn't even go into most of them. Maybe I can do a separate video explaining like all the terrible things about classical utilitarianism. But Mill's version of utilitarianism is much better, and I hope I've made that case for you.